to 6W TV channel. Hi friends, today we will see 25 things about the Titanic we thought were true, but are actually false. The sinking of the RMS Titanic was one of the most devastating disasters in modern history. The sinking of the RMS Titanic was one of the most devastating disasters in modern history. The luxury ocean liner infamously sunk on its maiden voyage from Southampton, England to New York City on an icy April night in 1912, resulting in the perishing of more than 1,500 passengers and crew. In her time, she was the largest ship to sail the Atlantic, and one of 3 new luxury White Star Line ships, making the media hype around the ship's sailing a major topic of the day. With such a tragic loss follows rumors and myths, some based on truth and others complete fabrications to add mystery to the sinking. After all, it was a highly publicized voyage and was carrying some of society's richest when it sank in the North Atlantic just after 2 a.m. The perfect formula for conspiracy. Likewise, Hollywood's obsession with the Titanic feeds the falsehoods about the real ship, and James Cameron's 1997 box office hit Titanic is, unfortunately, the source of facts for many interested viewers. Fortunately, we do have contemporary evidence from photos and news articles, as well as from survivors themselves. The discovery of the wreckage of the Titanic in 1985 gave scientists new details of the sinking, which had previously remained unknown for over 70 years, so it's time for us to listen to historic and scientific facts, and leave the cinematic productions in the realm of entertainment. 25 false. White Star Line advertised Titanic as unsinkable. The major misconception about the Titanic was that the White Star Line, the company that built the Titanic, made a massive claim that their newest ship was so innovative that it was entirely unsinkable. Its sealed watertight compartments equipped with doors that could shut off flooding in the event of an accident, and there was no fear of a disaster. A crew member was reported to have said God himself could not sink this ship, as passengers were boarding, and though this has never been proven, the quote exploded after the sinking, perpetuating the rumor that it was a claim made by White Star Line. 24 false. The captain and crew were trying to set a speed record. We've all heard that the Titanic was racing for New York, trying to substantiate claims that she was big and bad, and fast, and her captain not to be messed with. This is why the ship strayed into dangerous waters, steaming along the icebergs lurking at every turn. In truth, people knew Titanic was fast and had the best engines and boilers in her day, but she wasn't a racing boat. At the time of impact, most of the Titanic's boilers weren't lit, the most solid evidence that the ship was casually traveling. Alternatively, if you look at a map of the Titanic's route, it's not suitable for setting records. 23 false. Titanic was the first ship to use the SOS distress call. The sinking of the Titanic may have popularized the Morse code distress call SOS save our ship, but it certainly was not the first to have used the call. Titanic's radio operators used the more common Marconi call, CQD, first, since it was well established and would be more recognizable than the newfangled SOS, which had come into international effect in 1908 after being proposed 2 years earlier at the International Radio-Telegraphic Convention in Berlin. It was used a handful of times, but only became standard after the Titanic disaster. 22 false. The women and children first policy revolutionized the maritime industry. If there's one thing that comes to mind when you think of Titanic's crew loading passengers into lifeboats, it's probably the women and children first protocol that the disaster became famous for. At first, it might seem a romantic and chivalrous sentiment, but what really happened that night is much different from the fictionalized accounts. In truth, while women and children were given preference if they were present, men were not refused access to the lifeboats when the situation became dire, and neither was it a common practice after the event among other ships sinking. 21 false. The band's final song was a somber hymn. The story of Titanic's band alone is the stuff of myth. According to legend, the band played on deck as the ship began to sink, and for hours as chaos broke out, they played on. They allegedly tried to keep frantic passengers calm as the stern began to rise vertically, and while this is true, there is much debate as to their final song. They are reported to have played the hymn, "Nearer, My God, to Thee," though anyone still aboard the ship by the time they played their last song would not have survived. In the aftermath, the Daily Mirror reported the band's song choice, but as all 7 members of the band perished, we'll never truly know. 20 false, more lifeboats would have saved everyone. After the sinking, we tried to place blame on every event leading up to it, and all the chaos surrounding the lifeboat crisis is one of the most legitimate causes of loss of life without factoring in the conspiracy. It's true the Titanic carried only enough lifeboats to fit 1,178 of her 2,224 passengers and crew, and even from that, only 705 were saved. Naturally, if Titanic had been equipped with enough lifeboats for everybody, loss of life would have been dramatically reduced, except it wouldn't have. Titanic had roughly 2.5 hours to save people, and even with the appropriate number of lifeboats, time is what was needed to save lives. 19 false. The size of the tear in Titanic's hull was 300 feet. At 11:40 p.m. ship's time, the Titanic grazed the iceberg, nothing too serious, the crew thought at first. It woke a few passengers on the lower decks, but for the most part, seemed like just a scrape. Except, apparently, that brushing the iceberg tore a 300-foot-long gash through the starboard side and flooded the ship's double bottom and watertight compartments. Harland and Wolff architect Edward Wilding always argued against this theory, and recent ultrasonic scanning of the wreck shows that a series of small tears, each no longer than a few inches, caused the ultimate sinking of the ship. 18 false. There was a cursed treasure on board. Perhaps the Titanic sank because it was carrying ancient treasure stolen from a tomb in Egypt, or worse, a mummy, naturally bringing a curse on board. There was talk in the first-class smoking parlor among passengers Douglas Murray and T.W. Stead, who told stories of a cursed mummy back in England. Both survived, and later sold their story to the newspapers, which got distorted to the point of including the mummy in the story of Titanic. The mummy in question, the priestess of Amenre, was never loaded onto the Titanic, and in fact, has been on exhibit at the British Museum since before the disaster. 17 false. Titanic's sinking was the worst maritime disaster in history. There's no doubt that Titanic's unfortunate end is the most famous ship disaster in history, and we have mixed feelings about the story, including those of romantic sentiments and tragic devastation. It was widely publicized and still fascinates us as much as it captivated the world in its immediate aftermath. However, it was not the worst maritime tragedy, and if we only consider peacetime shipwrecks, the worst goes to the Philippine ferry Dona Paz, whose sinking in 1987 caused over 4,300 people to perish. Titanic's sinking was notable in its day simply because it was the world's largest ship. 16 false. Workers were trapped in the hull during construction. This rumor started as a pub tale in Ireland, Titanic's native land, probably by those who worked on Titanic. White Star Line shipyard, Harland and Wolff, was located in Belfast and consisted of mostly Irish workers. More seasoned workers would tell tales to the younger ones, and they found that telling the amateurs that workers often were trapped in the Titanic's hull was especially hilarious. In truth, the inspectors would often tap the hull to check the riveters at the end of the workday, and the sound could easily seem like someone trapped inside, leading to some mischievous workers making up the stories. 15 false. Nearby ships spotted the sinking and did nothing. Titanic frantically radioed messages as the crew realized she was doomed, and since the incident was late at night, many ships nearby had their radios switched off. However, ships did respond, and even Titanic's sister ship Olympic sent word that it was racing to help. Legend has it that a passing ship, the Samson, saw Titanic's flares, but carried on without a second glance. The Samson was nowhere near Titanic in reality, and the one ship that could have made it in time, the Californian, didn't receive calls for help. The first ship to reach the Titanic's survivors was the RMS Carpathia, 2 hours after the sinking. 14 False. Everything Captain Smith did in his final hours. There has always been much debate about Titanic's captain, Edward Smith, and since he perished with the ship, he wasn't able to defend himself against unsubstantiated claims. Captain Smith played an imperative role in trying to save the Titanic and helping passengers save themselves. He captained White Star Line's Olympic the year earlier, with even more pomp than Titanic, and was trusted with the second sister ship. But in an attempt to justify the tragedy, many turned to blame the captain, despite claims being unsupported. We do know he went down with his ship, which was the most honorable thing a captain could do. 13 False. Titanic's Catholic builders believed it was cursed. One of the most ominous myths surrounding Titanic, and another supposed curse upon the ship, was that of its anti-Catholic construction number. It was said that the Catholics, who were actually Protestant, who worked on Titanic, noticed when they weren't playing pranks on the younger laborers that the construction number on the hull was 390904, rather unsuspecting until you mirror the next and realize it strangely resembles the phrase "No Pope." This was particularly haunting to Catholics, who knew before it was even finished that the ship was cursed. Debunking this, the number issued to her was 401, significantly less spooky. 12 False. White Star Line ships were inherently unlucky. Of all Titanic's curses, you'd think at least one was true. White Star Line made a point of not holding launching spectacles for their ships when it was common practice to, for good luck of course. On most ships' debuts, companies would make a ceremony of transferring the new ship into the water, involving cheering, blessings, and large crowds, often smashing a bottle of champagne off the bow as a sacrifice. Thing is, White Star Line never participated in such ceremonies with any of their ships, and if the legend is true, Titanic wasn't blessed or properly bid good luck, which is why she sank. 11 False. First Officer Murdoch was a scheming villain. Much of our image of First Officer Murdoch comes from James Cameron's Titanic, and despite playing a rather small part in the film, giving viewers a lasting impression. There were survivors' reports of an officer taking his own life on deck just as crew members launched the last lifeboat, who could have been Murdoch, and Cameron took creative liberty in his film where this played out. However, when it came to loading lifeboats, Murdoch launched quicker and fuller than his counterpart at the other lifeboat station, and when there weren't enough women and children to fill a boat, he loaded men on, saving over 60 more lives. 10 False. Men dressed as women to get on lifeboats. If you were a young man with no facial hair and a particularly feminine figure, maybe this would have worked. Unfortunately, nobody actually tried it. This never stopped the newspapers from reporting it and targeting one story of a male survivor. William Sloper was a first-class passenger and one of the first to learn of the danger. He happened upon Officer Murdoch's lifeboats and was invited to get in. Not wanting to leave the brightly lit ship for the cold, dark water, his friend Dorothy Gibson demanded he enters the lifeboat with her. The New York Herald later sensationalized his story, so that he escaped in women's clothing. 9 False. White Star Line chairman, J. Bruce Ismay, sacrificed passengers in order to save himself. Ismay was chairman of White Star Line at the time of Titanic's sinking, and was aboard the ship on its only voyage, making him one of the highest-profiled survivors and the most controversial. Almost everything we hear about Ismay is negative. Stories portray him as the greedy businessman who took a spot in a lifeboat, while hundreds of poor women and children waited in line. The story makes for a juicy movie scene or, better yet, a newspaper article, which, like many other Titanic stories, was fabricated by papers owned by the Hearst Empire. Ismay, in reality, just happened to be in the right place at the right time. 8 False. Media giant David Sarnoff was the first to receive news of Titanic's sinking. David Sarnoff was a U.S. radio pioneer and a prominent telecommunicator in the early 20th century. As far as his role in Titanic's radio distress signals goes, he was committed to his post to confirm its fate. Some say that he was the first in New York to receive Titanic's calls for help, but this isn't exactly true. He did receive its calls, but not until much later than they were sent. Once they came into his station at Wanamaker department store, he stayed for 3 days, dedicated to hearing more information, and when Carpathia docked in New York City, he was waiting at the port. 7 False. Passenger Frank Tower survived 3 major shipwrecks. If Titanic was inherently unlucky, then one of its crew members harbored all the luck the ship needed. Frank Tower was supposedly a fireman who worked on Titanic's lower decks. He managed to save himself during the sinking of the ship, then later went on to work on the Empress of Ireland, a ship that sank after colliding with another ship, Storsad, 2 years later. After surviving that, he happened to be aboard the RMS Lusitania during World War I and escaped yet another sinking. There's no record of a Frank Tower ever boarding any of these ships, and thus is born out of urban maritime legend. 6 False. Steerage passengers were locked below deck during sinking. Our hearts have all collectively broken when we saw the steerage passengers locked behind gates in Cameron's Titanic, an officer brandishing a gun when they tried to storm them. Thankfully, this was never how passengers were treated on the ship, and were given just as much a chance as upper-class passengers. It's true there were lockable gates to lower decks, but these were only to be used when the poorer passengers, mostly continental European or Irish, were found to be carrying disease. Of course, this wasn't the best way to treat your passengers, but the gates weren't used in the event of a disaster. 5 False. The champagne bottle at the christening ceremony didn't break. Tying into the curse of Titanic not being correctly christened, another story says that Titanic was. The ship's owners took part in the usual champagne bottle ceremony, but it didn't quite go according to plan. Once the bottle clattered against the hull, it failed to shatter, and the Titanic wasn't baptized by the bubbly golden drink. This wasn't true since White Star Line didn't christen their ships, but maybe they should have since both Titanic and her sister ship, the HMHS Britannic, sank, making up 2/3 of the luxury Olympic-class steamships. 4 False. A coal fire sank Titanic. A new theory has recently surfaced, arguing that a coal fire may have contributed to the Titanic's fate. Smithsonian Channel has aired a documentary presented by Senan Malani, who claims that photographic evidence from before the Titanic's departure shows that fire weakened part of the hull so badly that it was visible in grainy, early photography. See the dark smudge in this photograph. Titanic scholars have refuted these claims, their counterargument that coal fires were commonplace on coal-powered ships, and that the fire was known about since 1912. Were it a concern, the ship would not have sailed. 3 False. Titanic was intentionally sunk in a banking conspiracy. The conspiracy that the Titanic was intentionally sunk by bankers in order to create the Federal Reserve is one of the most far-fetched conspiracies, yet it still attracts its followers. When you take some of the millionaires and important businessmen who were lost with Titanic, such as John Jacob Astor IV and Isidor Straus, among dozens of others, it can at first seem plausible. But it just isn't true. Those millionaires didn't have much to do with the Federal Reserve, and U.S. banking dynasties supporting it had more important rivals to skirt. All in all, it would have been more trouble than it was worth to build such a massive ship and then sink it. 2 False. The captain and crew ignored weather warnings. Playing on Captain Smith's character, it's said that in order to make his speed record and earn himself endless praise, he ignored weather warnings and ordered his crew to speed up the ship and press on even faster through the night. It might stem from the fact that Smith was a commanding captain and pushed his ships and crew harder than most captains would, but he was in no way reckless. He had all of the crew informed of iceberg warnings, then pinned them up in the chat room. Smith was daring, but not dangerous enough to cause the fatal end of the Titanic. 1 False. White Star Line failed to adhere to lifeboat laws. Lifeboat myths seem to be our favorite way to explain Titanic's tragedy, but they all prove to be false. It wasn't the fault of White Star Line's negligence that so many perished with Titanic. In fact, Titanic had an excessive number of lifeboats in an attempt to keep passengers safe. The laws of the day required a number of lifeboats unique to each ship based on its weight, not its passenger capacity, or even the number of tickets purchased. In Titanic's case, she was required to have lifeboats that could carry 1,060 passengers, yet she was fitted with enough to carry 1,178. I hope you liked our video. Please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more videos. Thanks.